All right, my name is Adam Goldstein. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Hipmunk. Hipmunk is a website that tries to take the agony out of searching for flights and hotels. I don't know much about user experience, but what I do know is what I've discovered through working on Hipmunk. And so I hope in the next 20 or so minutes to share with you some of the things that I've discovered and some of the theories that I've come up with retroactively to explain why it, after all, was a good idea to start a company like this. But before I do that, let me start with a brief story. I am a nerd. And in college, I was a particular kind of nerd, a debate nerd. I would travel around the country and the world with my team. We went all over the place. We would fly to San Francisco for a weekend from Boston. We would go to London or Paris, to Gaborone, Botswana. You name it, we would travel there, typically flying. And after a while, because I was a nerd for these things, people started asking me to book their trips as well. And I found myself spending a lot of time on other websites like the ones that Jesse mentioned. And I saw checkboxes like this. And I thought, well, that's funny. I wonder why this checkbox is even there in the first place. And if they really have to put it there, why isn't it checked by default? And I thought, that's interesting, but what about other sites? Well, I would go to a site like Kayak, and I would find that a screen would have dozens of search results that I had to process in my head. And in addition to dozens of results per page, there were dozens of pages of results that I would have to click through if I wanted to see and understand all of the options. So I thought, Then I went to Expedia, just looking around, trying to see what all these sites were doing. And when I was looking for flights, I noticed that Expedia was very aggressively trying to get this idea in my head that I should instead be looking for hotels. These are all the places on the page where they're trying to sell me hotels. Here are all the places they're trying to sell me cars. And here are all the places where they're trying to sell me packages or deals, which are trade industry code words for things that include hotels and cars. I discovered once I started Hipmunk that there's a reason for this. They make way more money from hotels and cars than they do from flights. But I was just looking for flights. And so all of this was an unwanted distraction that made me think perhaps there was some sort of an opportunity here. The final thing that really did it for me was when I went to Travelocity. And I looked at the way that they were using space on their first screen above the fold. It turns out that less than 1/5 of this space is actually being used for what I asked for. The rest of the space is being used for upsells and advertisements and things like that. And if I were using an older computer monitor, not the big one that I've got on my laptop, I probably wouldn't even see any search results on the first screen. So this was clearly an agonizing thing for me. I would spend hours searching for flights and hotels, but usually flights, across all of these different websites. And I got incredibly frustrated with the process. So I called up my friend Steve Huffman, who was one of the founders of Reddit. And I said, Steve, I'm sick and tired of searching for flights online. And he said, me too. I said, great. Well, maybe there's an opportunity for us to break into this space. And he said, I'm not so sure. Well, I thought to myself, there are really two strategies for entering into a crowded market. There are two ways to approach the problem. And I'm hoping that I can persuade you that the user experience approach is the best one. But just to tie this to the real world, suppose you're in a physical crowded market, like a bazaar. What are the two strategies that you see people using in those places to get customers and to stay in business? Well, the first strategy is what I call the yelling strategy. This is the person who just screams out that they've got the best papayas, or that if you buy 2 tomatoes, you'll get your third one free. They get in your face. They send people out into the crowd to yank you over to their booth. This is the strategy that's very aggressively in your face, that's just trying to get people to come to the booth and hoping that over time they'll be able to get those people to buy something. The parallel online to this would be this, right? It's in your face. It's stealing your attention. They have no hope of actually making you like their product, but if they get enough people to click on this ad, then you bet they'll make money. So The idea here is that there's a class of approach in which you try to capture people's attention, capture the attention of those who don't have much attention to spare, and trade that attention for a chance at making money from them using your product or service. So that's one approach. The second approach is what I call the smile approach. You can see I'm using a little bit of loaded language here. The fact here is that you can compete in a crowded bazaar, even when lots of people are yelling, by creating great experiences when people come to your particular stand. You can not tell them that you're going to give them something free if they come, but just do it as a nice gesture when they get there. You can give them tips on how to use the tomatoes that you're selling in a soup or something like that. You can give people pleasant surprises that make them want to come back and tell their friends. So it's not a game of volume. It's not a game of trying to get as many people as possible to take a look. It's a game of taking the people who do take a look and making them glad that they did. And I think the online equivalent to this would be Zappos. I made this slideshow before I even realized Zappos was sponsoring this. But I think that this is a great example, right? An incredibly crowded market. Shoe sales. There's both physical and online stores that had been doing this for years. But they said, well, if we just give people a great expectation and exceed that great expectation, then they will continue to come back and use this site over and over again. And that's how they managed to get bought for, I don't know exactly how much, but a lot of money by a very important company, and how they've even continued after that to make lots of people really happy. So there can be, obviously, a balance between these two strategies. You can simultaneously yell and be nice to people when they get there. And I think that eventually, any company in a crowded market ends up taking on some combination of these two approaches. But I think that if you're in a crowded market, as opposed to a new market, if you're in a crowded market, I think it makes sense to focus on the experience strategy, to at least put off the yelling for a while until you're sure that you've built something that'll actually make people smile. And I think that's particularly true today, because commoditization and standardization of data and of goods and of services means that what you're building your product on is likely quite similar to what someone else is building their product on that you're competing against. Banking data, travel data, your Facebook profile. These are all things that many different companies can have access to, and have access to in basically the same form. So if you're going to compete against someone else and you're essentially offering the same end result, then you really, I think, need to focus on presenting that result in a way that's useful rather than just trying to yell, because eventually people will discover that you've got the same data as someone else does. Now, yelling can work, but I think that there are 4 problems with it, especially when you're entering a crowded market. The first is that it costs an enormous amount of money. And I think that having spent some time in online travel, which is a really expensive market, I can see why. The fact of the matter is that you have to outbid the companies that are already spending money to get users in whatever field you're in. And those existing companies in the market have probably spent years figuring out the most efficient places to deploy their money, the places to yell the loudest, and how to yell it, and in what tone of voice, and to what users, and all of those sorts of things. They've optimized more of that than you could possibly imagine. And so you have 2 choices. You can either spend money in the places that they already are, which means you're going to have to outbid them. You're going to have to spend more money than them. Or you're going to have to spend money in places that they aren't using, which most likely they're not using because they don't work very well. So one way or the other, you're going to end up spending a lot of money if you choose to yell to get people to your product rather than just creating a great experience. The second reason is because I think that oversaturation is like earmuffs. If lots and lots of people are yelling at you, you stop listening to what any particular one of them is yelling. And I think that this is particularly true as the generations advance. I'm 23 years old. I have 20 tabs open in my web browser. I have YouTube running on a separate monitor somewhere, and I'm reading like a physical newspaper maybe if I'm lucky. So all of these things are trying to steal my attention, which means that each ad that shows up is less and less effective every year that I advance in life, every year that someone grows up another year who's 10 or 12 years old right now. So I think that even if advertising, even if yelling really loudly works well today, there's a good chance that it won't work well 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. So I think that that's another danger with focusing on the yelling strategy. I also think, conversely, that the yelling strategy is reproducible. So this is kind of a subtle contrast with what I was saying before about it being expensive. If you build a great strategy, a strategy that's really successful at yelling at people and getting them to come to your site, then your secret sauce as a company are the people within your organization that manage that funnel, that manage the expenditures. Those people can get up and leave one day and start their own company because they already know what works and how to spend money efficiently. So there's a great chance at any moment that when you succeed, the people who made you succeed will leave and start their own competing site. And all that you will have is the historical data. All that they will have is the knowledge of how to build a system that works well at yelling at people. That's a pretty tenuous thing to build a sustainable advantage on. But the final problem, and the most pernicious one, is that I think that when you focus on yelling at customers as your primary strategy, it's culturally corrosive to your organization. It breeds a disregard of what customers actually want. Because instead of thinking and designing your product around them, you're pitching it to them. And it makes it very easy to justify, for example, obtaining data about your customers through shady means, because it's going to help you yell at them more effectively and efficiently. And I think that when you know that all of the other companies that you're competing against are using this yelling strategy, and you know that you're using this yelling strategy, you can justify to yourself this race to the bottom. You say, there's this new technology. Yeah, it's a little shady. People don't know that we're reselling their personal information, that we're buying their personal information, all those sorts of things. But if we don't do it, one of our competitors will first, and they're going to be able to yell more effectively and make more money as a result. So once you commit yourself to the strategy of yelling, it becomes much easier to justify a lot of things that I think have ethical implications that are pretty uncomfortable. So that's why when Steve and I started Hipmunk, we took the user experience approach. And I don't think we consciously knew that that's what we were doing. It just seemed like the sensible thing to do at the time. When we built our flight search tool, it looked totally different than any of the other sites out there. We laid everything out according to the time of day in this sort of Gantt chart for flights. And you could easily see how long the flights were, how long the layovers were, which airlines they were, and all those sorts of things. And we did two other things that were considered completely radical by all of the other companies in the industry. The first is that we sorted our results not by price, but what we called agony, which is a combination of price, but also includes the number of stops and the total trip time. And the other thing that we did, which was even more radical than that, was we hid most of the results. We actually filtered out 70 or 80% of the results on your average result page, because we figured out through our own algorithms that they were things virtually no one would ever click on. And so we were able to show you all of the most relevant results on a single screen rather than only showing you two results on a single screen. And we did a similar thing with hotels when we eventually got around to that. We decided that we were going to show you where in a city the hot spots are that you might be interested in. So if you tell us you're interested in nightlife, well, then the red spots on the map show you where the hot spots of nightlife are. And then we laid the hotels on top of that so that you could see which hotels are closest to those hot spots. And within a few minutes, you could figure out which was the right hotel, rather than having to have 5 different tabs open comparing reviews, maps, and business information. For us, this user experience has been an enormous unfair advantage. And I think that there are 3 reasons for this. The first is stickiness. This goes back to that example of the bazaar. When people try out Hipmunk, they might not get it on the first try. They might go back to Expedia, they might go back to Kayak. But when they come back to Hipmunk a second time, and they've been to those other sites in between, they realize how fundamentally different it is and how entirely focused it is on the user experience. No advertisements, all of the relevant results on a single page. And that means that people come back over and over and over again. And we don't have to keep yelling at the same people to get them to try out the site. Once we've reached them once, then they're going to come back for a long time. The second thing is that it's been incredibly good for PR. I mean, we've had to spend virtually nothing on getting the word out because reporters write about us for free. And I think that there are reasons that reporters do that. And these are sort of cynical reasons, but I think they're true. Reporters are educated people, they're cultured, or at least they like to think of themselves as educated and cultured. And to them, any site that makes it easier to do something, that has a better experience, has an immediate newsworthy component that it might not have to the average person in the country. And so if you can reach a reporter with a good user experience, you get this enormous multiplier effect because they'll do the job of then writing about it to other people. And while this is probably mostly true for consumer tech, I think that even within trade publications, reporters are always looking for a good user experience because it's a hook in which to write their article. The final thing that user experience did for us is virality. That's a virus, in case you're wondering. Now, this is tricky because we don't have any built-in network effects. We're a travel search site. It's not like people are upvoting travel tips or anything like that. But even so, the fact that we've built this fundamentally different and useful user experience means that people are constantly talking about Hipmunk on Twitter, on Facebook, on email. They're calling their parents. They're showing their friends when they're home for Christmas. These are the reactions that no other travel site can get. And I think it's because the focus on user experience shows through so clearly in every decision that we make. Now, with enough money, you can overcome any of this. With enough money, you can build something that's OK, and you can spend enough so that you can outbid everyone else and yell loud enough that everyone will hear it. And that's the strategy that the multi-billion-dollar companies in travel, in banking, in all sorts of different fields have undertaken. But if you're trying to make people talk about your product, if you're trying to make people come back to your product, I think it makes a lot more sense to listen to them rather than to yell at them. And I think the best way to do that is by building your entire focus around user experience. Now, that's at least what we've tried at Hipmunk, and it's worked pretty well for us so far. So I probably haven't told many of you anything that you didn't know already, but I hope that I've taught you some things, some examples and some anecdotes that are useful from the startup perspective. Because in each crowded market, as I think we've heard today and the previous days, there is going to be someone who manages to change the market, who manages to steal market share from the companies that are already there. And I find it hard to believe that as customers become more cynical, as younger people get older, and as more and more people are yelling, that yelling will continue to be as effective as it is today. I think 10 years from now, maybe even 5 years from now, the winning companies in each crowded market will be the ones that focus on user experience. Thank you very much.